Very good. If you're just joining us, this is just to let you know that today is the 7th day since Russia moved into Ukraine and started a military engagement there. There are casualties on both sides. Yesterday, I was listening to Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, where he was saying that so far, about 500 Russian soldiers, have lost their lives. On the other hand, the Ukrainian, they have lost about 2,600 people because of this conflict. The West has moved in with sweeping sanctions. Whether they are going to have an impact on Russia, the jury is still out. This is not the first time that the West is imposing harsh financial sanctions on Russia. Remember, they did this when Russia moved into Ukraine again in 2014, and they hived off part of Russia in the name of, part of Ukraine in the name of Crimea. This time around, they are there, and it's just a question of days before they move into the capital city, which is Kiev. This morning, as I was waking up, and I was going through the briefings, and there was confirmation that the Russians have managed to take over the city of Kharkiv, which is Ukraine's second biggest city, with a population of about 1.4 million people. They have taken over. That was according to the mayor. And they have also moved to the port city of Odessa. The question is this: how far and how long will this conflict continue, and what kind of impact is this likely to have on Kenya, on Africa, and the rest of the world? I may not have this question for now, but I have a person in the studio. He's an expert on geopolitics as well as security matters. His name is Delano Kiilu. You have seen him actually here, and I tell you, when he analyzes these things, you like them. Kiilu, thank you very much indeed for finding time again this morning to be with us here. Help us understand things. Why would a farmer in Karachuonyo care about what is going on between Russia and Ukraine?
Well, thank you very much, O'Brien, and it is such a pleasure to be a guest once more with you. It's a very unique time. I think that we are now facing, as a world, new crises. We haven't seen this type of dimension of challenges, and we expected that 2022 would be a bit more smooth sailing. However, that farmer in Karachuonyo, he's a farmer. He relies and depends on farm inputs in order for him to raise whatever crops he is growing. What many people don't know today is that a lot of those farm inputs actually come in from Ukraine. Some few are imported from Russia, but we rely heavily on countries like Ukraine for farm inputs and for us to be able to carry out or conduct our normal business. That same farmer is also impacted because of rising fuel prices due to all the factors that are challenging currently global crude oil prices. So the minute that the oil prices go up, that farmer in Karachuonyo is paying more for diesel, for the tractor that's going to plow his farm, also paying more to get his produce to the market, which means his cost factors are increasing. His cost of living, because he's maybe not only dependent on his family's upkeep from the perspective of what they grow on the farm, the cost of what he needs to purchase is going up. If he has children, his school fees is going up. So we're looking overall at a more difficult environment for that farmer in Karachuonyo to be able to operate in, simply due to this particular conflict that is currently occurring in between Russia and Ukraine. It's good that you have brought in the issue of fertilizer, and we know for sure that Kenya imports almost 60% of its fertilizer needs from Ukraine. There has been a lot of conversation around the cost of fertilizer in this country, which has almost doubled in the last 3 years. To transfer money from country to country or from bank to bank, they are now being removed on the 12th of March. That has now just been confirmed. What does that mean? That means that Russia is being put into a place of pain from a perspective of sanctions. But the question is Russia able to also inflict pain from its particular position? And when we look at its invasion of Ukraine, it had already possibly already worked out some of these things, because we can see that from the planning stages, this has been long coming. The current Russian Minister of Defense, that is Sergei Shoigu, has been there and was installed since 2012. And during his tenure, you've seen the annexation of the Crimea, you've seen the breakaway republics, DPR and LHR, you've seen all those, the Luhansk and Donbass breaking away, you've seen all those things happening. So this has been in planning for a very, very, very long time. What does this mean for us, O'Brien?
So it's proper to say that he's a battle-hardened minister.
He's a very battle-hardened minister. He's a general. He's a general, and a military general at that. So they have been thinking through all the situations. And what many people don't understand is that Russia is very closely knit and interwoven internally in terms of how it does its own internal trading, etc. It is dependent on imports, and its biggest trading partner currently is actually China. And China is, sorry to say, in bed with Russia. It's not going to change its stance as far as the relationship is concerned. Russia and China, those are the biggest trading partners. And if you want to compare and contrast, all of Russia's trade with the entire continent of Africa, over 55 countries, is only 10% of what Russia is trading with China.
With China.
But you know what? What many people don't also see is why all of a sudden all these nations that are putting sanctions on Russia, what is making them so afraid? Just 2 days ago, the Russian President Vladimir Putin pushed his naval, that is his submarine fleets, and his nuclear submarine fleets at that, to go and do some military exercises in the Barents Sea. For those who don't know where the Barents Sea is, that is actually off the coast of Norway. So that is on the northern tip of Europe. And the Barents Sea, if you're thinking strategically, is also not a very long distance, because it's very close to the Arctic, that it can be able, if you're sending off nuclear intercontinental ballistic missiles, to reach the continental United States of America. So here you are putting sanctions on Vladimir Putin as the president of Russia. At the same time, he's gone into what we call military and naval exercises, and he's put his nuclear forces on high alert. That means he's holding a dagger at the back of the people who are putting sanctions on him, regardless of this current conflict that's taking place in Ukraine. And then you begin to understand the geopolitics of what's happening right now. And that's why, even though many European nations had decided that they would support Ukraine by providing them with their old Soviet warplanes, they then very quickly retracted only 2 days ago and decided that they're not going to share those planes with the Ukrainians. They don't want to get involved.
And this is after Putin said that any Western military warfare used in Ukraine will be seen as an act of aggression.
Exactly.
And they're going to react.
Exactly. And when somebody says an act of aggression, it simply says, in other words, you want to declare war against me. And if you declare war against me, then I will have the right to do whatever I want to do. Also remember, right now, the trust level of international nations to do with the statements made by the Russian president, the trust level is extremely low. Why? Because he started off all these military exercises, and we've been monitoring from here. Zapad, for example, 2021, which was the exercise in and around similar to what happened this year. And it was very, very large. And for us, we were monitoring and saying this exercise seems a bit too large to just be an exercise. Why are we having such a large exercise? The same question which we asked at the beginning of this year. So in constant press conferences and press statements, the president said that he would not invade Ukraine. And then the very next day, on the 24th of February, he went ahead and exactly did that. So you can understand the position of many nations around the world in not trusting the fact that these are just nuclear military exercises taking place in various places like the Barents Sea and other parts of the world. They're very concerned that Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, might actually cross the line, the unbroken line
of nuclear war.
They're very, very worried about that. That's a key concern.
Look,
it's a threat.
As a security expert, I think it was on Sunday where, Vladimir Putin said that or ordered his special forces to be on high alert. And the world took this to mean that he has ordered his nuclear forces, to be on alert. And he said that if NATO or the West intervenes in this war, he's going to act very, very fast. What did you interpret that to mean?
It meant very simple. Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, is putting himself into a position of dominant influence from a weaponized perspective. In other words, he's saying, I have a gun and I am now loading the gun. I've not yet pointed it at you, but please be aware that I am holding a gun. So it's not yet smoking, it's not yet pointed at you, but please be aware that I am armed. If we look into the background now from a security expert perspective, what is he exactly talking about? Precisely, Russia, over the last few years, has been really, and forgive the words, but hell-bent on developing nuclear missiles and their platforms which can evade missile defenses. That's all that they've been doing. They've built it out, and they are so far advanced with hypersonic weapons delivery systems.
And actually, they are ahead even of the United States.
Actually, they're way ahead of the rest of the world. And they have platforms such as the Kinzhal, which Russia doesn't even need to go very far. It has a 3,000-kilometer range at hypersonic speeds, is able to evade missile defenses. Theoretically, Russia, from within its territory, using a Kinzhal, could hit even the United Kingdom. So these are the things that are making many global leaders very cautious of how they approach Russia and what kind of decisions they want to make in any discussion with Russia. Couple that with some of the supersonic bombers that Russia has in its air force. Those have great range, and refueled, they can almost reach any part of the world. And with a 3,000-kilometer range, that means that these planes can actually unleash hypersonic missile delivery platforms from way beyond the horizon into targets on the other side of the horizon. And this, very few people and very few nations have the capacity or even the ability to defend against such kind of aggression. So what they're saying is, yes, we understand that there is a form of aggression that is currently taking place in Ukraine. However, is it yet at what we call the WCS? What is the worst case scenario? In a worst case scenario, where are we? What are we talking about? And many nations cannot tolerate or accept the challenge of being able to have any attack against their current territory. I'll give you a good example. Like, the risk to a country that is not so far from Russia, like Germany, is extremely high. They would not want to have anything to do with the civilian population being touched by any form of threat. And that's why you see this diplomatic position being taken. And in theory, the only thing that the countries can do currently is impose sanctions.
Very good. I mean, I want you to hold your thoughts on that, because I want to take us to Mombasa. Let's come back to the studio and discuss the geopolitics of the Ukraine-Russia conflict. And we are doing this in the company of Delano Kiilu. He's a geopolitics expert as well as a security person. So, Kiilu, before we went for that live link there in Mombasa, I wanted to find out from you the kind of reaction that the West has, over Russia. Was this what you were expecting? Because a lot of people were expecting that the moment Russians move into Ukraine, NATO was going to react militarily. But this has not happened. Actually, what we are seeing is NATO countries, backing off from this crisis.
Yes, and that is actually, in fact, Ukraine is not a NATO member and never has been. Ukraine is part of the former USSR, and when that broke up, they then became a breakaway republic, established their own nation, so to speak, as Ukraine. And Ukraine has never joined either the European Union, European Commission, or NATO. There have been some discussions towards that, but up until the moment that the Russian military moved into Ukraine, that had not happened, in fact. Therefore, there was nothing legally that NATO could do, because legally NATO partners are up to the border of Ukraine, not beyond the border of Ukraine. So if they were to intervene in Ukraine, they would be breaking their own rules and laws and compacts.
But let's face it, I mean, the reason why Russia is in Ukraine and the reason why Ukrainian cities are being pummeled by Russian military warfare is because of their dalliance with NATO.
Well, Partially, only partially.
Yeah, that's part of the reason.
Yes, only partially. The main reason why the challenge exists today is because for some reason Russia and its leadership have decided that they want to expand their territory and they want to do so aggressively. And they believe because they were already successful 2014, 2016, 2018 with the building of the bridge across to the Crimea, they believe that nobody is going to stop them because previously nobody has. They were able to blockade the Sea of Azov with no interventions and nobody really giving them any headaches. And because of all those previous successes, they're saying, look, we will take this back. Besides, this belonged to us. And besides, we have so many Russian-speaking citizens in these territories, it's actually ours. And we believe that the regime that is running that may not be the one that should be there. So Russia has seen that it can aggressively take that. Now, if we factor that from a fractional consideration, you see that about 170,000 troops amassed outside of the borders of Ukraine on the pretext of performing military exercises. That is a small fraction. That is less than 10%, O'Brien, of Russia's total military forces, which number beyond 1.8 million.
Actually, 1.9 million soldiers.
Exactly. A lot of them are conscripts, and conscripts are not supposed to fight outside the borders. So this is where the confusion now comes in as to how come there was all the posturing by NATO saying, you know, Russia, you must be careful, Russia, you must not do this, and if you do this, we will take action. And then when Russia did it, no action was taken. Well, it's very simple. Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, decided to call the bluff. And he called it. And it was found on the other side that actually, there was nothing that NATO could do. And there's actually pragmatically nothing that NATO can do when it's not a member country of NATO. So Ukraine was left in the lurch. Ukraine is under-militarized to be able to defend itself against Russian aggression. Russia is using non-conventional weapons and strategies and techniques to take over. You just mentioned at the beginning of this session that Russia has now completely taken over the second largest city in Ukraine, Kharkiv.
Yeah.
And you saw how they did it. They started with the kinetics. They started with some very, very large explosions. And then it was completely pummeling any form of defense that Ukraine might have had to that. So you can imagine if we talked about this in the context of Kenya. Mombasa is completely taken.
Yeah.
It weakens the remaining resistance that the Russians are anticipating in Ukraine.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that the people want this. It just means that Russia had really thought and planned about this for a very long time. And they knew exactly strategically where they wanted to go. And you see them attacking from the sea. You see them attacking on the land. You see them using kinetics or the missiles to get into territories which are hard to reach. And you see them also providing what you call psychological intimidation. A good example, O'Brien, of psychological intimidation is within some of the battle tactical groups, their BTGs. You see them now bringing in this particular T-72 tank, which has been modified, and on top of that, it's carrying thermobaric missiles, which are banned actually for use on civilian populations. So that alone is simply trying to send a message that, look, I'm threatening you with a weapon that you really can't defend yourself against. So this is the strategy of the Russian president, and he's not stopping there. A lot of the military analysts who have been looking at this are saying, wait a minute, this force is far too large to be only interested in taking Ukraine. So what really is the end goal of the Russian president and the Russian leadership? It looks like they are planning something even bigger on a grander scale. And at this moment, you know, there's what we call the point of no return, the PNR.
Do you think they have gotten
They
there?
already crossed the PNR. They crossed the PNR by taking over 75% of the troops that were on military exercises into Ukraine. They crossed that. Now, anything that the Russian president does, everybody is saying, the United Nations yesterday passed a resolution to say, look, Russia, we have resolved as all the other countries that you must retreat, you must withdraw all your forces from Ukraine. And the Russian president, if he does that, what happens to him?
Very good. You know, the other thing that, you know, is coming out of this conflict is how far do you think Russia or Vladimir Putin is willing to go with this conflict? And what message do you think he's sending to the rest of the world?
It's very simple. The psychoanalysis of the current situation or state of mind of the Russian president is that he's willing to use all the tools in his arsenal. That is his current state. He's saying, if we were to put it in context in Kiswahili, kama mbaya mbaya. That is what he has said. Kama mbaya mbaya. I'm doing this. If anybody tries to stop me, too bad for you. So he's really thrown all his cards onto the deck, and he's going all out for it. He has no intention of stopping. And he's simply saying, look, you either allow me to take this and keep it, or else I face you and I deal with you. And I have the capacity to deal with you. Now, whether he's bluffing or not, many nations don't know. But intelligence analysts...
And nobody wants to risk with that.
Nobody wants to risk with that, because they're saying that this man has the ability at an order through his various structures, military structures. He can really touch almost any part of the planet right now with destructive capabilities. So nobody wants to risk their populations and their way of life by actually challenging the bluff. So right now, Russia is in a very unique position. It's very strong and very dominant, but the sanctions are intended to simply bleed it and to take away some of that strength, because military strength is based on the basis of strong economic and financial strength, which is what Russia has had for quite a few years. It isn't the biggest military spender on the planet. However, it does have sufficient arsenal to make it a challenge for neighboring countries. Countries such as Germany have really never upgraded their military capabilities to the extent where they can be able to defend against that. They've been depending on NATO, that NATO will be here for us in case anything goes wrong. All of us can, work together to be able to do that. But even right now, we can see the disparities between the various states, as well as the various typical types of armaments that militaries have been provided with.
Yeah, and I mean, let's try to put Russia, into perspective. Russia is the 11th largest economy in the world. It is the second biggest military force in the world. Russia is the world's #1 exporter of natural gas, is the world's biggest exporter of wheat, fertilizer, nickel, palladium, diamonds, and aluminium. And it is the #3 exporter of oil. The other thing that you need to understand is that Russia has the world's biggest nuclear warfare. Correct?
That is very correct.
How do you then deal with this kind of a country as NATO or the world?
It has to be dealt with diplomatically. O'Brien, there is no other option. Currently, in fact, we really condole with all the Ukrainians and the families that have lost their lives in Ukraine, as well as even the Russian families, because Russian mothers sent their children, their sons, some of their daughters, to go for a military training exercise. The next thing, their son or their daughter is saying, hey, guess what? I'm actually in Ukraine. I don't know if I'm going to survive this, and no more messages after that. So families all around that entire region are losing lives. And one person said that in war, there is no victor. It's actually the civilian population that is suffering the most. When you hear the statistics like what you've just mentioned about Russia, this is it brings on the other factor. Why is Europe so reticent? Why is Europe not jumping up and saying, hey, you can't do this, and we're coming after you, and we're even stepping into Russian territory? Why is Europe not moving? Because Russia is supplying them with a huge amount of their fuel, including gas, that is actually heating and warming up their homes. Remember, this is very strategic. I mentioned to you that this has been planned out for a long time. When exactly it would happen? This is the coldest time in Europe currently, at this season. So, of course,
countries like Germany, which is Europe's biggest economy, relies on Russia. 75% of its gas comes from Russia.
Exactly. And Russian gas is still flowing.
They're still selling.
It's still flowing. Currently, the homes in Europe are currently being heated by Russian gas.
Tell me this. Last week, Kenya, through its ambassador to the UN, Ambassador Kimani, issued a very strong-worded statement against the conflict in Russia, which was hailed by the West as one of the best speeches at the UN. What do you make of that?
Dr. Ambassador Martin Kimani is really a pride of this nation called Kenya. His boldness and his eloquence in being able to objectively state the current situation that had occurred when he made that particular statement is absolutely outstanding and deserving of praise. When he made that particular statement, he was not positioning Kenya as a country against Russia. He was making a statement as Kenya, who sits on the United Nations Security Council, who has taken a place representative of the rest of the African continent and representative of the views of many around the world, and he was simply elaborating on that this is the wrong thing to do. So what we make of that statement is, yes, he did have the support and entirely drove that from a leadership perspective as Kenya, but it just goes to show you, O'Brien, the depth of intellect and the depth of knowledge, understanding and wisdom that we have in this nation. Many of our talents are now being recognized on a global scale, and that can only happen if people like Dr. Ambassador Martin Kimani are able to have the space to play on the global stage. So he did that, and many people took note because others were afraid to make such bold and strong statements.
There was a feeling that, Kenya was biting more than it can chew. In the past, Kenya has always maintained a status of a neutral observer or player in this kind of Cold War issues. Do you agree with that feeling?
I think Kenya has not necessarily been neutral. Kenya has been diplomatic. So it's not about Kenya being neutral. Kenya has been very diplomatic in its communication. But a point reached in the whole process last week where Kenya needed to be very clear on the loss of life, on the risks, and on the challenges. And it came out quite clearly, which should make Kenya very, very proud that actually loss of human life, there is no bargain point or bargain chip for the loss of life. And I thank God that Ambassador Martin Kimani, representing Kenya, was able to share those words. Because if we had come out with a weaker position, you'll notice in yesterday's United Nations resolution that a number of countries actually abstained from the vote. Our neighboring countries...
Actually, majority of them were Africans.
Yes, Uganda, Tanzania, Sudan, South Africa, Senegal,
Zimbabwe.
So many of them. And one person once said, it is better to say yes or no rather than to abstain from making a decision.
Very good. I want you to hold your thought on that. I mean, we are having some very interesting conversation there on the meaning of Russia-Ukraine conflict to Kenya. So let's come back to the conversation here in studio, even as we wind up our conversation. Kiilu, I mean, one of the low moments of the Russian-Ukrainian crisis was seeing Africans being turned at the border between Europe and Ukraine. And the world never reacted, with the zeal you would expect this to happen. What do you make of that?
Well, in times of conflict and times of crisis and in times of war, people do not behave rationally. So we can't expect everybody to behave rationally. You'll be very surprised to find that in particular situations, even within families, it becomes every man for himself and God for us all in a lot of situations.
But the way the white people were treated compared to the way black people were treated, I mean,
it is intolerance, O'Brien. We agree. It's not acceptable. It's not acceptable. But it's also good to give the full context of what was happening. The full context, it was not only Africans. It was also Indians. It was also Asians. It was also South Americans. There were quite a number of people. As long as you were not Ukrainian, there was kind of some bit of little squabble and differentiation at that particular border crossing, and it wasn't all countries. So we understand that Romania actually did a very good job. But there were issues at the border with Poland, and although that the Kenyan government had already communicated with Poland, we understand that one or two people had severe challenges. Now, during times of conflict, remember, normal rules seem to be dropped. But we actually encourage that humanity should always continue. People should behave in a rational manner, although it's not expected. Why? Because the threat and risk levels right now, man is subsiding back into a state of flight and fear. And all that can be guided. Even that underlying undertoned racism, we see it even in the reporting, even in some of the journalism that was coming out from some of the initial statements that were made, where you saw journalists saying, we didn't expect this to happen in the place where we have people with white skin and blonde hair and blue eyes. And, you know, these are catastrophic statements to be made on global platforms. We don't expect that kind of behavior.
But I also want to, you know, your thoughts on this. I mean, and I think, you know, we are yet to understand what is the Russians or Vladimir Putin's end game in this whole crisis. What would happen to the world economy if the conflict between Russia and Ukraine was to become elongated?
Number one, anytime that a military steps into another country in an invasive action, such as what Russia has done with Ukraine, number one, that is going to be a long haul. You can't switch it on and then switch it off tomorrow, because you've already created a state of conflict. In this particular case, we mentioned the battle tactical groups, the BTGs of the Russian army. There are so many of them already inside Ukraine. You've just mentioned that the city of Kharkiv has been taken. Russia does not want to relinquish that. That means that we're looking at a long haul in terms of conflict or in terms of those military elements that are still sitting in Ukraine. What does that mean for the world? One, the first thing it means for the world is psychological anguish.
What is that?
Psychological anguish is even if I'm sitting in Kadhonzwene, and this is the news every single day. All the news, when I put on KBC or I listen to the radio, KBC radio, and all I'm hearing is the number of dead and the number of lives lost and the children who are killed. There's a psychological trauma that comes upon the people. It is not, you know, you're always hearing terrible news that is emanating from a particular area. You begin then to tag that region with negative aspects of humanity. And then you don't want to deal or transact with that region, regardless of whether there are normal people there or not. So that such that even when the situation may return to normal, it becomes difficult for you to conceptualize ordinary life there. So first of all, globally, there is trauma. Globally, that's why you see so many hashtags trending on social media that I stand with this, I stand with that, I do this, I do that, because people are feeling something. Now, worse than that, people are beginning to act on those feelings. And you saw with the Ukrainian President Zelensky, when he requested and welcomed fighters from other nations to go and join him, that a lot of these nations, you saw individuals who have tactical and military combat experience or training beginning to actually sign up and saying, I'm going to fight in Ukraine. I'm going to fight in Ukraine. This also has a negative impact. Worst case scenario, which is currently occurring right now, unfortunately, right at the beginning of this conflict, because all of a sudden, the president of Ukraine was left with no option. He saw that NATO is not coming to his assistance. Nobody seems to want to help him. He went back to his citizens and said, citizens, arm yourselves and get ready. Now, we do know that Ukraine has huge reserves and people who have been trained militarily. They had something similar, but not the same as NYS, where they trained their people. And so all of a sudden, all these citizens are told, go to the police stations, pick up automatic and semi-automatic rifles and magazines, and go ahead and defend your nation.
Quickly, because we want to go to the United Nations environmental program where President Uhuru Kenyatta has just made his entry. I want also to hear your last thoughts on this. Do you see the world getting into a third world, into a third world war?
Well, O'Brien, the world is not heading towards a third world war. We can't afford it. We don't want it. It's not something that is desired. And every effort is being made by global leaders around the world to prevent that from happening. Because if that were to occur, remember, we are not now in the 1940s. The kind of technology and weaponry that is available, a third world war would be very short and very devastating to all parts of the planet.
Thank you very much, Delano, for your time. We have to go to the UN at Kiilu, where President Uhuru Kenyatta is on the podium. Thank you for your time. Good afternoon.